He paid to tear two souls apart and cursed himself in the process. In a quiet African village where spirits still whisper through the trees, Kofi stood in the shadows, watching the only woman he ever loved love someone else. Abeni, radiant and free, had moved on, but Kofi hadn't. Burning with jealousy, he went to Mama Zawadi, the feared priestess, and made a dark pact. Separate them at any cost. And so the nightmare began. A marriage once filled with joy became a storm of arguments, strange dreams, and unseen forces. What Kofi didn't know was that the spirit he unleashed would not only haunt them, but claim him. The love you steal, steals you back. If you believe love should never be forced, comment below. Real love can't be bought. The sun bled across the sky like an open wound as the old bus coughed to a stop in the heart of the village. Dust rose around it, curling in golden spirals, and as the door creaked open, Kofi stepped down with nothing but a small canvas bag and a soul scorched by memory. The air here hadn't changed, thick with heat, laced with the scent of dry earth and burning firewood. But everything else had. The laughter of children echoed differently. The trees seemed quieter, and the home he had once known. It now belonged to ghosts. He walked past the narrow path lined with crooked trees, where he and Abeni used to sneak out to watch the stars. He could almost hear her laugh in the rustle of the leaves. It had been 8 years since he'd left, full of dreams, full of arrogance. He told himself he'd return rich, powerful, unshakable. But the city had stripped him bare, and now here he was again, not triumphant, not victorious, but hollowed out by regrets he could no longer outrun. When he reached the market square, he saw her. She was there, standing by the well with a clay pot balanced on her hip, sunlight tangled in her hair. Abeni. The name hit him like a thunderclap to the chest. Her eyes, wide and alive, flickered with laughter as she chatted with the vendor beside her. There was a lightness in her, one he remembered but no longer understood, and beside her stood a man, strong, grounded, gentle in his movements. Damilola, her husband. Kofi froze, hidden in the shade of the butcher's stall. His breath caught, the air turned to glass in his lungs. This was the woman he had once dreamed of marrying, the woman who had waited for letters that never came, promises that were never kept. And now she belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't abandoned her, someone who'd stayed. He watched them laugh. She leaned into Damilola, her fingers brushing his arm, casual, intimate. It wasn't just affection. It was home, and that was the moment Kofi's sorrow curdled into something darker, jealousy. He turned before they saw him, his footsteps sharp on the stone path as he walked away, faster, head down, blood boiling. He didn't know where he was going, just away from the sight of her smile, away from the image of what he lost. No, what had been stolen from him. Later that evening, as the village bathed in twilight, Kofi sat alone in the hut his uncle had left behind. Empty, dusty, abandoned like him. The silence was thick, broken only by the whisper of wind brushing through the cracked walls. He lit a small lamp, watching the flame dance. It reminded him of Abeni, wild, untouchable. His thoughts spun, tangled with memories, her laughter in the rain, her hand in his, the kiss by the river, the way she cried when he left and how he told her to wait. And she had waited, for months, maybe even a year, until she didn't. After everything, "You forgot me," he whispered to the night, as if she might hear. But it wasn't forgetfulness that cut him. It was the ease with which she moved on, how she had built a life without him, how she had been happy. He couldn't sleep. Not with her image burned into his eyelids, not with the sound of her voice echoing in the corners of his mind. Around midnight, he rose and began walking, past the quiet homes, past the flickering lanterns, until the village melted into the edge of the forest. There, beneath a gnarled fig tree, was a narrow path no one used after dark. It led into the forbidden part of the forest, the place where Mama Zawadi was said to live. Some called her a priestess, others A witch, but all agreed she could touch the invisible, and she was the only one who might understand the ache burning in Coffee's chest. The walk was long, the air colder than it should have been, even for night. Branches scratched at his arms, and strange animal calls echoed through the dark. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, just before dawn, he reached a clearing. Her hut stood crooked and ancient, made of stone and wood, overgrown with vines. Skulls of birds and small beasts hung from the roof, rattling softly in the wind. A single lantern glowed inside. He hesitated, heart pounding. Then he knocked. The door creaked open by itself. Inside, the air was heavy with incense, smoke curling in patterns that didn't move like normal air. The walls were covered in symbols, charms, dried herbs, and bones tied with red twine. In the center of the room sat a figure draped in a black cloth, skin like cracked leather, eyes as pale as river stones. "You came," she said without looking. Coffee froze. "You dream of what you lost," she continued, voice low and ancient, "but not of what you did." He stepped forward. "I didn't do anything." "No," Mama Zawadi said, "and that was your first mistake." Her gaze pierced him. Coffee swallowed hard. "I want her back," he said. She was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and turned toward a low fire at the back of the hut. "Love cannot be summoned like rain," she muttered, stirring ashes in a carved bowl. "But what is broken can be corrupted." He watched her mix herbs and ashes, drawing shapes in the smoke. "I can separate them," she said, "not through hate, but through doubt. A spirit can be sent, one that whispers between hearts, one that makes a man question and a woman remember." Coffee's chest tightened. "Yes," he said, "that's what I want." "You want her to suffer," Mama Zawadi said simply. "No," he lied. "I want her to see that she belongs with me." She turned to him, her eyes suddenly glowing faintly. "And what will you give in return?" "I have money," he said quickly, pulling coins from his pouch. "And wine. And this." He reached into his bag and pulled out a photograph, a Beni, smiling under the mango tree, years ago, before Damilola, before everything. Mama Zawadi took it, held it to the smoke. "Money," she whispered. "Wine. A name. And a face." She dropped the photograph into the flames. Coffee flinched. A sudden wind swept through the hut, slamming the door shut. The smoke turned black. The fire hissed. "Then it is done," she said. He tried to speak, but his throat closed. The air felt heavier now, like something else had entered the room, something old. Mama Zawadi turned to him one last time. "But remember, son of the wind," she said, voice like crackling leaves, "the love you steal steals you back." Her words echoed in the silence as the fire dimmed, and Coffee stumbled out of the hut, breathless, heart racing, unaware that behind him something had awakened, something invisible and hungry. As the first light of dawn stretched across the sky, he smiled. "Soon," he thought, "soon she'll come back to me." But the forest behind him whispered a different promise, one he could no longer escape. The wind carried the smell of rain the next morning, heavy and metallic, though the clouds still clung to the horizon like dark bruises waiting to burst. Coffee woke before the roosters, his body drenched in sweat, his mind replaying the echo of Mama Zawadi's words again and again. "The love you steal steals you back." He tried to push the warning from his thoughts, convincing himself it was nothing more than the theatrics of an old woman who wanted to frighten him into paying more. He had given her what she asked for: money, wine, a photograph, and in return, she had promised to break what bound Abeni to another man. That was all that mattered. He left his hut and walked through the village, avoiding familiar faces. A few old friends greeted him with cautious curiosity, but he offered them only tight smiles. They whispered after he passed. Everyone remembered how he had left all those years ago with grand dreams of wealth and importance. To return empty-handed was humiliation enough. He had no wish to relive it in their pitying eyes, but something inside him hummed now with renewed confidence. The pact had been made. Soon, Abeni would be free. She would come to him. She had to. By midday, he reached the edge of the marketplace. The smell of smoked fish and roasted plantains filled the air. He caught sight of her again. Abeni, in her indigo dress, was bargaining with a vendor. Her laughter, bright and unguarded, rolled over him like thunder, but this time there was a flicker in her expression. Her hand trembled as she counted the coins. Damilola stood beside her, distracted, his jaw tense. They looked, for the first time, not perfect but strained. It sent a thrill through Coffee's veins. Perhaps the work had already begun. As he watched, a young boy ran through the market, bumping into Damilola and spilling a basket of yams. Damilola snapped at the child with unusual harshness. Abeni touched her husband's arm, whispering for calm, but he shook her off and stormed away. She stood frozen, confusion written across her face. Coffee turned and walked home, heart pounding with cruel satisfaction. The spirit was moving. That night, Abeni woke from a dream that clung to her skin like sweat. She was standing by the river, watching the water turn black. From the shadows across the bank, a voice called her name. She couldn't see who it was, but she felt the pull, as though her heart were being tugged from her chest. When she looked down, her reflection wasn't her own. It was Coffee's. She woke screaming, her breath caught in her throat. Damilola turned to her, alarmed, shaking her shoulder gently. "Another nightmare?" he asked, voice hoarse from sleep. She nodded, unable to find words. He held her close. "It's the heat," he murmured. "Or maybe the market's gossip. You worry too much." But even as he said it, his eyes drifted toward the window, uneasy. He had begun dreaming too, dreams of footsteps in the corridor, of whispers calling his name in voices that didn't belong to the living. The next day, their argument began over something small, a misplaced pot, a forgotten errand. But it grew until the walls of their house seemed to hum with tension. Damilola accused her of distraction. She accused him of coldness. By afternoon, he had gone to his fields without a word, and she had sat in the shade of the mango tree, heart aching with confusion. She didn't know where the anger came from. It felt foreign, like smoke from a fire burning far away, but creeping closer. In another part of the village, Coffee waited for news. He saw Abeni pass by the market alone, her eyes distant, her face drawn. When she crossed paths with him by chance, she stopped. The silence between them stretched until it broke under the weight of memory. "Coffee," she said softly. Her voice was the same, too familiar, too warm. It undid him. "I didn't think you would recognize me," he replied. "I could never forget." Her gaze faltered. "You're back." He nodded. "For good, this time." She hesitated. "The city swallowed me whole," he said. "But I survived." A smile ghosted her lips, sad and uncertain. "You always do." For a moment, they stood like that, two people bound by the ghosts of what could have been. Then she adjusted the cloth around her shoulders and stepped back. "I should go," she said quietly. "My husband—" "Yes," Coffee interrupted, bitterness slipping through. "Your husband." Her eyes flickered at his tone, but she said nothing more. She walked away, her steps quick, the wind tugging at her dress. He watched until she disappeared, the taste of her name still sharp on his tongue. That night, Coffee dreamed again. He was back in Mama Zawadi's hut. The fire burned blue, and the old woman's face emerged from the smoke. "You watch what is breaking," she said, "but you do not see what is breaking in you." He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. The walls of the hut began to pulse as if alive, the air thick with the sound of chanting. The photograph he had given her reappeared in his hands, but the image was changing, Abeni's face fading, his own growing darker, distorted. He woke, gasping, the echo of her warning roaring in his ears. Days passed, and the change in Abeni's home deepened. She began finding small things out of place, a necklace tangled in her bed net, a clay bowl cracked with no cause. At dusk, she heard whispers beneath the sound of crickets, murmurs too soft to understand, but too clear to dismiss. Damilola, once steady and patient, now walked through the house as if haunted. He muttered to himself, paced in circles, flinched at shadows. At first, she tried to pray it away. She lit candles, burned herbs, and sang the songs her grandmother had taught her to keep spirits calm, but the peace never lasted. The house felt thick with unseen eyes. At night, when she turned to touch her husband, his body was cold, his back turned, as though he were miles away. One evening, after yet another argument that ended with slammed doors and tears, Abeni left the house and walked to the river. The moon hung low and swollen, the water still as glass. She knelt by the bank, whispering a prayer, when she heard it again, a voice calling her name from across the river. It was gentle this time, almost tender. Abeni! Her heart stilled. She looked up. There, across the dark water, stood a shadow. She couldn't see the face, but the stance, the tilt of the head, it was unmistakable. Coffee. She blinked, and he was gone. She ran home, trembling. When she told Damilola, he stared at her as if she'd gone mad. "Coffee," he said, voice sharp. "Why would you see him? He's nothing to us." She lowered her head, tears burning her eyes. "I don't know," she whispered, "but something is wrong. I feel it." "You feel too much," he snapped. "Maybe your mind is the one whispering now." She turned away, wounded by the cruelty in his tone. He had never spoken to her like that before. She didn't know that he too had begun hearing the voice, a man's voice, mocking him in the night, telling him she was unfaithful, that she still longed for someone else. Back in his hut, Coffee felt the effects of the ritual growing stronger. It was as if the air itself shimmered around him, carrying energy that both thrilled and unnerved him. Each time he thought of Abeni, a sudden warmth filled his chest, a pulse of satisfaction that felt almost divine. But alongside it came something else, an ache deep in his bones, a heaviness that would not leave. He began to notice strange things. His shadow sometimes stretched longer than his body, twisting on the wall even when the light didn't move. When he fetched water, the reflection that stared back from the surface wasn't quite his own. His eyes in the reflection were darker, almost black, and behind him stood shapes he could not name. Once, he felt fingers brush the back of his neck, but when he turned, there was no one there. Still, he convinced himself it was a small price to pay. Soon, she would come to him. The bond between her and Damilola was unraveling thread by thread. All he had to do was wait. But the spirit that carried his desire didn't distinguish between what was asked and what was given. It fed on emotion, on longing, on rage, on fear. And now, having tasted all three, it began to spread. By the seventh day, the village noticed. Chickens refused to enter Abeni's yard. Children pointed and whispered that the house breathed at night. The elders muttered of restless ancestors, but Coffee didn't care about gossip. He watched from afar, his eyes fixed on Abeni as she moved through her days like a sleepwalker. Once, their gazes met again across the market, and this time she looked at him not with surprise, but with something deeper, an ache she couldn't name. That night, she dreamed once more of the river, the same dark water, the same voice. When she turned toward it this time, she saw him clearly. Coffee. But his eyes glowed faintly, and his smile wasn't the one she remembered. He held out a hand across the water. "Come," he said, "you don't belong there." Her heart pounded. She wanted to run, but her feet were buried in mud. The river rose around her ankles. When she screamed, her voice echoed back in his tone. She woke choking, her husband's arms around her, shaking her awake. Outside, the wind howled, and something heavy crashed against the door as if thrown by unseen hands. In his hut, miles away, Coffee jolted upright at the same moment. His lamp had gone out, though he hadn't blown it. The photograph he once gave Mama Zawadi now lay on his floor, untouched by fire, the edges smoking as if freshly burned. And for the first time since the ritual, fear found him. He whispered her name into the darkness. Abeni. The darkness whispered it back, but the voice was not hers. The village sky darkened earlier than usual, as if the sun itself was retreating from something it couldn't name. The clouds pressed low, heavy and bruised, hovering above the rooftops and casting shadows over every path. There was a strange hush in the air, broken only by the distant bleating of a goat or the creak of branches as the wind shifted with unnatural hesitation. In the midst of that uneasy quiet, Abeni stood by the fire inside her kitchen hut, her hands shaking as she stirred a pot of okra soup. She had dropped the salt twice, first the lid, then the entire bag. It wasn't like her. Her hands were normally sure, precise. She prided herself on her calmness, but lately her body no longer felt like it belonged to her. She would reach for something and forget why. She would speak and not remember what she'd said. Damilola had started watching her with a distance that pierced deeper than any words. When he came in that evening, the smell of palm oil and dried fish filled the air, but his face twisted in a scowl. "Again?" he asked. She turned, confused. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing at the pot, "the same soup, the same everything." She blinked, caught off guard by the venom in his voice. "It's what we have. I haven't been to the market yet. You used to make something different every day. Now it's like you don't care." His words sliced through her, not because of what he said, but because of the tone. There had been tension for days now, but this resentment was new. It didn't sound like her husband at all. "I'm tired, Dami," she said softly. "I haven't been sleeping. You know that." "You haven't been sleeping," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "And I haven't had a proper meal in a week. What exactly are you doing all day?" She stared at him. "You think I'm lazy now." "I think something's not right with you," he snapped, and then, immediately, his face shifted, guilt replacing anger. "I didn't mean that." But the words had already landed. Abeni felt the sting behind her eyes, but she refused to let the tears fall. She turned back to the pot and stirred in silence. Behind her, Damilola sat down, burying his face in his hands. They ate without speaking. The only sound was the scraping of wooden spoons against clay bowls. That night, the dreams returned. Abeni stood at the threshold of her house, but the door wouldn't open. Inside, she could hear voices, hers and Damilola's, arguing, but the words were warped, stretched, as if underwater. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The wind picked up, and the ground beneath her cracked open. From the chasm rose a shadow, tall and fluid, wearing her own face like a mask. It whispered her name. When she woke, her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might stop. The air in the room felt cold, though all the windows were closed. Beside her, Damilola lay stiff, his face turned away. His breath was shallow, almost strained. She reached for him, but he shifted, pulling away. The next morning, he left before sunrise. No kiss, no goodbye. She sat at the edge of the bed long after he'd gone, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress. Her mind swirled with questions. Was she going mad? Was this some sickness she didn't understand? Or was something being done to them? Abeni dressed slowly and went to the home of Nana Ajua, the oldest woman in the village, known for her wisdom and knowledge of the old ways. She had lived through famine, war and plague, and had seen many things others would not even speak of. Nana sat outside under a large baobab tree, grinding dried herbs with practiced hands. "You look like you've seen a spirit," the old woman said before Abeni even spoke. Abeni sat beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I have." And then the story poured out of her. Everything. The arguments, the dreams, the strange voice, the way Damilola was changing. Nana listened without interrupting, her hands never stopping their rhythm. When Abeni finished, Nana stopped grinding and stared at her for a long time. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a handful of white cowrie shells, casting them onto the ground in a small circle. The old woman's eyes narrowed. She leaned in closer. "There's a spirit between you and your husband," she said at last, "a heavy one. It moves like smoke. It feeds on love." Abeni's heart dropped. What does that mean? It means someone called it. Someone summoned it to divide what was whole. Abeni went cold. "Who?" Nana gathered the shells again and cast them once more. This time, her hand hovered above one of them, her expression sharpening. "You know who," she said simply. The answer was a blade to the chest. "Coffee," she whispered. Nana nodded. "He still walks with longing, and he has opened a door that should have stayed shut." Abeni felt sick. Her mind reeled, trying to process the weight of it all. "Can it be undone?" she asked. Nana looked to the sky. "Spirits can be dismissed, but it takes strength and truth. You and your husband must stand together. That's the only way." "But he barely speaks to me anymore," Abeni said. "He sees me as something else, not the woman he married." "Then you must remind him," Nana said. "Before the spirit finishes what it started." Back at home, Coffee sat on the edge of his sleeping mat, staring at the bowl of water he'd placed in the center of the room. The water had gone dark again. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker, a movement at the edge of the reflection. But now, he saw full faces, not always human. Sometimes they grinned, sometimes they cried. One drew the water bubbled without heat, and a voice rose from it, repeating Abeni's name in a broken, sing-song whisper. He hadn't returned to Mama Zawadi. He didn't dare. Something told him that if he saw her again, he would not leave the forest whole. But he couldn't stop. Every day he checked the market. Every night he listened to the whispers. He felt power now, humming just beneath his skin. But it came with shadows, with cold. He tried to remember the warmth Abeni once gave him, her smile, her touch, but even those memories felt corrupted now. When he thought of her, his pulse raced, but his mind filled with images of fire and ash, of loss, of hands pulling her away. In his mind, it was always Damilola's fault. Damilola had stolen what was his. Damilola had taken the place he was meant to fill. But deep inside, buried under years of pain and resentment, a small voice asked, was it truly Damilola? Or had she simply chosen another life, a better life? He slammed his fist into the floor, trying to silence the doubt. That night, Abeni prepared for Damilola's return. She cooked his favorite dish, grilled tilapia with spicy pepper sauce. She laid out clean clothes. She lit candles and sang softly, her voice trembling but steady. When he returned, he looked at her with guarded suspicion. "What's all this?" he asked. She stepped forward, hands open. "I want us back." He looked at the food, the light, the effort. His expression softened, but only slightly. "Abeni, I don't know what's happening to us." She took his hands. "Then let's fight it, together. Whatever this is, it's not stronger than us." His eyes searched hers for a long moment. Then he nodded. They ate in silence, but the tension slowly began to lift. When they lay down that night, Damilola wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time in weeks, they slept without dreaming. But in the shadows, just outside their home, something moved. The spirit, sensing its grip weakening, began to shift. It slithered through the village like a scent on the wind, seeking cracks in the walls, doubts in the hearts. And it found Coffee, still awake, still staring into the darkness. The fire in his hut flared suddenly, without warning. The air grew thick, And then she appeared, not Abeni, but Mama Zawadi, not in flesh, in smoke. Her voice came not from her lips, but from everywhere at once. "You do not own what was never yours," she said. Coffee stood, trembling. "You told me I could bring her back." "No," she said. "I told you you could destroy. You chose that path. It's not too late," he pleaded. Her eyes burned brighter. "It is already done. The spirit you called no longer listens to your voice. It listens only to pain." He stepped back. "Then banish it. End it." "I cannot," she replied. "Only they can." And then she was gone. The fire died, and Coffee, for the first time since his return, felt alone, utterly and completely alone, in a house that no longer felt like his, in a village that no longer welcomed him, haunted not by the loss of Abeni, but by the truth of what he had become. Abeni awoke to the sound of bird song, faint and cautious, as though even the trees feared to fully stretch into morning. The light that slipped through the window was soft, filtered through thin clouds and uncertain skies, but for the first time in weeks, she did not wake to the weight of dread pressing on her chest. Damilola still slept beside her, arms wrapped around her waist, his breath steady against the back of her neck. His presence felt real again, anchoring, not distant or laced with that haunting coldness that had shadowed their home for days. She turned slowly in his arms, brushing a strand of hair from his brow. He stirred, eyes blinking open with quiet recognition. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other. And in that silence, there was something almost sacred, the echo of love remembered. "Did you sleep?" she asked softly. He nodded. "No dreams, just rest." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "Then maybe we're coming back." They rose together that morning. Abeni lit incense in each corner of the house and swept the floors with herbs blessed by Nana Ajua. Damilola stepped outside and poured libations to his ancestors, speaking their names with reverence and calling them to guard their home from whatever evil had entered. The scent of gin and kola nut mingled in the air. Neighbors watched from a distance, curious but silent, as the couple moved with solemn purpose. But while they worked to reclaim peace, Coffee's world twisted further into shadow. His hut, once still and eerily calm, had grown restless. The walls groaned as if breathing. The floor pulsed under his feet like a living thing. The photograph of Abeni, once burned in Mama Zawadi's fire, had returned again that morning, this time resting atop his mat, untouched by flames but wet. As though pulled from river water, her face on the paper had changed, no longer smiling, no longer distant. She looked directly at him now, eyes hollow, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-cry. Coffee sat on the ground, knees drawn to his chest, unable to sleep, unable to eat. The satisfaction that had filled him at the beginning, the thrill of watching her joy unravel, was gone. It had been replaced by something colder, something darker, regret, perhaps, or fear. He couldn't tell anymore. Every time he tried to pray, his voice cracked. Every time he tried to forget, a whisper echoed through his hut, repeating the same phrase in a language he didn't know. It vibrated through his bones, wrapping itself around his spine, his ribs, his skull. He lit a fire, hoping the warmth would chase the chill from his skin, but the flames flickered green, then blue, then snuffed themselves out entirely. And then came the smell, rotten, metallic, wet earth and blood. Coffee ran outside, gasping for air, but the scent followed him. It clung to his clothes, his skin, his tongue. He stumbled to the river, stripping off his shirt and plunging his hands into the cold water. The surface rippled violently as if something beneath it thrashed. He pulled back, terrified. In the reflection, his face was not his own. His eyes were pitch black, his mouth smiled without permission, and over his shoulder a shadow loomed. He screamed and fell backward onto the mud, trembling. From the trees nearby, a group of boys gathering firewood stopped and stared. One of them crossed his chest and muttered a prayer. The others simply ran. Word spread quickly. By dusk, no one would speak to Coffee directly. Children were warned not to take paths near his hut. Women changed directions when they saw him walking toward them. Even the men who once shared drinks with him now avoided his gaze. He had become a walking omen, cursed not just by whispers but by the air itself. And yet, he could not bring himself to leave. He told himself it was because of Abeni, because the ritual was not yet finished, that if he stayed just a little longer, she would still come to him. But deep inside, he knew the truth. He was trapped. The thing he had called forth had fastened itself to him. Wherever he went, it followed. Wherever he slept, it waited. At the same time, within Abeni and Damilola's home, the energy had begun to shift. That night, they prayed together, not with scripted words, but with trembling hearts and whispered truths. "I felt something," Damilola confessed, eyes fixed on the candle between them. "It wasn't just anger, it was like something inside me, twisted." "I felt it too," Abeni replied, "like someone else was watching, like I wasn't me." They held each other then, as if bracing against the wind of a coming storm. But something strange happened in the middle of the night. Abeni woke to the sound of laughter. Not Damilola's, not hers. A child's laughter, soft and distant, echoing from somewhere inside the house. She sat up, heart racing, eyes darting in the dark. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Damilola stirred but didn't wake. She rose, wrapped a cloth around her shoulders, and followed the sound. It led her to the front room, where the candle had gone out. The door stood slightly open. Cold air brushed her skin, and in the doorway stood a figure, a small child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was barefoot, wearing only a thin white cloth, and his back was turned. She stepped closer. "Little one, are you lost?" The child didn't move. She reached out, hand trembling, but before she could touch him, the child turned around, and his face was gone. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. He opened his arms and screamed. The sound wasn't that of a child. It was deep, ancient, full of fury and fire. Abeni stumbled back, falling to the floor, her head hitting the side of a stool. Everything went black. When she woke, Damilola was shaking her, his voice panicked. "What happened? Abeni, what happened?" She sat up slowly, pain pounding through her skull. "There was a child, but he wasn't real. I think it was part of the spirit." Damilola helped her to her feet. "We can't stay here." She nodded. "We need help. Real help." That morning, they went to the shrine on the hill, where the old priest and his apprentices welcomed them with solemn faces. They explained everything, the dreams, the fights, the whispers, the shadow child, the priest, a man with eyes like river stones and a voice like carved wood, nodded slowly. "There is a spirit," he confirmed, "one of longing. It was called by name through ritual and sacrifice. It is not of your home. It is of his." He didn't have to say Coffee's name. They all knew. "Then how do we end it?" Damilola asked. "How do we cast it out?" The priest looked at them with sadness. "You must go to the place it was called," he said. "You must confront the one who called it, and you must do it together. Only truth can cut a bond made with lies." That evening, as the sun bled once more across the sky, Abeni and Damilola walked through the village toward the edge of the forest. People watched them pass, silent and wide-eyed. No one dared stop them. They walked hand in hand, hearts steady despite the fear clinging to their bones. At the edge of the village, they saw him, Coffee. He sat by the tree where the path led into the woods, eyes hollow, skin pale. He looked up as they approached, and for a moment none of them spoke. Then Abeni stepped forward. "Why?" she asked. Her voice didn't tremble. "Why would you do this to me?" Coffee looked at her, eyes glistening with tears he could no longer hold. "Because I loved you," he said. "That's not love." Damilola said, stepping beside her. That's possession. Coffee's face twisted. I was supposed to be the one. You promised. I waited for you, Abeni said. I prayed for you. You never came. You forgot me. And now you want to punish me for healing. Coffee dropped his head, ashamed. I thought if I broke it, if I made him go, you would remember what we had. I never forgot, she said. But you did. You forgot what love truly is. And you let your bitterness call something that doesn't belong in this world. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. Coffee looked up at them, and for the first time, the pride was gone. Only sorrow remained. Then help me, he whispered. Help me end it. The three of them stepped into the forest together, toward the place where the ritual had begun, unaware that the spirit was already waiting, and that it had no intention of letting any of them leave whole. The forest swallowed them. As Coffee, Abeni, and Damilola stepped past the first line of trees, the air seemed to shift, growing denser, heavier. The sounds of the village behind them, roosters, distant laughter, the rustle of daily life, faded like a dream upon waking. What remained was the murmur of leaves, the creak of ancient branches, and a silence so profound it pulsed with meaning. This was not just any forest. This was the place where the unseen lived, where ancestors whispered, where the wind carried names not spoken aloud. And now it was where a spirit, born from longing and summoned by pride, waited to complete what had been started. Coffee led them with hesitant steps. His body ached. His mind buzzed with voices he could no longer distinguish from his own thoughts. The farther they went, the more the forest seemed to recognize him, not with welcome, but with ownership. The trees leaned inward as if watching. The roots twisted across the path, trying to trip him. Insects flew in spirals above his head, forming strange symbols before vanishing, but he didn't stop. Behind him, Abeni walked with a stiffness born not from fear, but determination. Every step deeper into the forest was a step toward reclaiming her life, her marriage, her peace. Damilola, steady and silent, walked at her side. His jaw was clenched, but his hand never left hers. They reached the clearing by dusk. It was just as Coffee remembered it, wide, open and unnaturally still. The ground was blackened in places, as though fire had scorched it, yet no tree bore marks of burning. In the center stood the remnants of Mama Zawadi's shrine, a ring of stones, a broken gourd, feathers now rotting in the dirt, but she was not there. Only the spirit was. It didn't show itself at first. Instead, the wind stopped. The air grew colder. The shadows stretched, crawling along the ground in directions that defied the light. Then came the sound, a soft humming, like a lullaby sung through broken teeth. Abeni gripped Damilola's hand tighter. What now? He whispered. Coffee stepped forward, into the center of the clearing. His eyes were glassy. It began here, he said. So it must end here. He raised his arms. I called you, he said aloud. I offered my name, my blood, my soul. I called you to break what was not mine to touch. The wind rose suddenly, sharp and bitter, whipping through the clearing like a scream. The trees bent. The shadows convulsed. Coffee dropped to his knees. I take it back. From behind him, Abeni shouted, We do not fear you. Then Damilola added, This bond was not yours to break. The air rippled, and finally the spirit showed itself. It did not take one form. It was many. At once a child, a woman, a beast, a shadow. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched wide and red. It hovered above the ground, tethered to nothing, and when it spoke, it used Abeni's voice. Then Damilola's, then Coffee's. You broke the vow, it hissed. You invited me. Coffee raised his head. And now I uninvite you. The spirit laughed, a sound that made the trees bleed. You are nothing without your bitterness. You are mine now. Then it lunged. Coffee cried out, clutching his chest as if something inside him had torn loose. Abeni ran to him, but the spirit struck the earth between them, sending her flying back. Damilola stepped forward, standing over Coffee, arms wide. "You cannot have him," he shouted. "You cannot take what is not yours." The spirit screamed, shrill and furious, and the clearing filled with wind and smoke. The ground cracked. A tree behind them burst into flames, burning blue. Abeni crawled forward, coughing, her voice raw. "You came from pain, but we don't fear you anymore." The spirit turned to her, eyes narrowing. "You loved him once," it said. "You still do." She nodded. "Yes, I loved who he was, but I will not love what he's become." With that, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pouch, Nana Ajua's charm, wrapped in red cloth and tied with sacred thread. She tossed it into the fire. The charm exploded in a burst of white light, and the spirit shrieked, its form beginning to fracture. Parts of it split away. The child's face, the woman's voice, the beast's claws. They twisted in the air, spinning and howling until they collapsed into smoke. But one piece remained, the shadow. It darted toward Coffee. He stood now, barely upright, his face pale, lips cracked. "I give myself," he whispered. "Take me and leave them." "No!" Abeni shouted. But Coffee turned to her, eyes soft for the first time in years. "This was my doing," he said. "Let it end with me." The shadow paused, hovering, as if considering. Then it surged into him. Coffee's body jerked backward, his mouth open in a silent scream. The wind stopped, the light faded, and then, with a final breath, he collapsed. Abeni and Damilola rushed to him, but he was already gone. The forest exhaled, the smoke lifted, the trees stilled. The spirit was gone. They buried him at the edge of the clearing, under the tree where he had first confessed his love to Abeni, many years ago. There was no crowd, no ceremony, only the sound of leaves falling and the quiet prayer of two people who had survived what many never would. Back in the village, life slowly returned to normal. The birds sang, the children played near the river again. Abeni and Damilola rebuilt what had been broken, slowly, honestly. The shadows in their home were gone. The dreams no longer came, but neither of them spoke of Coffee again, except once. Many months later, Abeni stood at the edge of the forest, the wind cool against her skin. She closed her eyes, whispered his name, and left a single white flower at the base of the tree. Then she turned and walked home. The rains came early that year. Heavy and unrelenting, they poured over the village like a cleansing ritual from the heavens. Every rooftop echoed with the percussion of water, every gutter overflowed, and the red earth softened under each drop, turning into rivers of mud that slithered between homes. The villagers said it was a sign that the land itself was purging what had been festering in silence, that the ancestors had accepted a sacrifice, and now they were washing everything clean. Inside the compound Abeni shared with Damilola, silence reigned, but not the uneasy kind that once crept in like fog. This silence was peaceful, rooted in healing, in the quiet rebuilding of something nearly lost. The strange events that had shaken their home, the voices in the night, the cold arguments, the creeping dread, had lifted entirely. In their place was an unfamiliar calm, one that neither of them had yet dared to fully embrace. Abeni sat by the fire one morning, stirring ogi in a clay pot, her movements slow and careful. She no longer rushed through tasks the way she used to. Her world, once spinning on expectation and routine, had shifted. Time had softened. The brush with darkness had taught her to measure her breath, to weigh her words, to listen more than speak. Damilola emerged from the back hut, stretching his arms and blinking against the pale light of the clouded dawn. He looked older now, not in years, but in gravity. The lines around his eyes had deepened, his shoulders carried a new weight, not of fear, but of knowing. He came to her side and placed a hand on her back, fingers splayed wide, as if reminding himself she was still there. She looked up at him, her eyes still tired but warm. "You didn't dream," he shook his head. "Nothing. Just sleep. Quiet sleep." She nodded. "Me too." He crouched beside her, staring into the pot. The silence between them stretched again, but now it was full of unspoken gratitude. He didn't need to say it aloud. She already knew. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. She glanced at him, brow raised. "I want us to bless the house again. Invite the elders, the priest. Let the spirits know we're still here, still grateful." Abeni paused, then smiled. "Yes, it's time." Later that week, they did exactly that. The house was swept and scrubbed, every corner washed with blessed water and smoked with sage. The old priest came with his white robes and carved staff, murmuring ancient prayers in the language of their forebears. The neighbors gathered outside, humming, clapping softly as the invocations filled the compound like warm wind. Children tossed petals into the air. A goat was sacrificed, its blood accepted into the earth as offering. Damilola stood tall throughout the ceremony, but his hand never left Abeni's. Every time the priest circled them, sprinkling water, she felt his fingers squeeze hers slightly, a silent vow that they would never again be torn apart by silence. And when the ceremony ended and the last of the drums faded, the people cheered, not loudly, but with reverence, as if witnessing not just a cleansing, but a resurrection. But still, one shadow remained, not in the house. In Abeni's heart. That night, after the visitors had gone, after the candles had burned low and Damilola lay asleep, she sat outside under the mango tree, staring at the sky. The stars were faint through the thinning clouds, but they were there, watching, waiting. She held a bundle in her lap. Carefully wrapped in linen were the last remnants of Coffee's memory, an old handkerchief he'd once given her in their youth, a dried flower he'd tucked behind her ear, a note he'd never had the courage to deliver, but that had somehow found its way back to her after his death. She had found it folded inside the pocket of her market bag weeks ago, though she had no idea how it got there. She opened it once more, the ink faded but legible. "Abeni, if I were braver, I would say this out loud, but since I am not, I will say it here. I never stopped loving you. Not once. If I had stayed, if I had fought for you, but I didn't. And now, all I have is this silence. Forgive me for loving you too late." Her hands trembled as she folded the note again, tears rolling down her cheeks. It was a soft grief, not the sharp, unbearable pain that had come with betrayal and fear, but a quiet mourning for something that had once been pure and simple, before time, ego, and circumstance ruined it. She rose and walked to the riverbank behind the compound. The water flowed gently now, calm after weeks of chaos. She kneeled at the edge, her white cloth trailing in the mud, and placed the bundle on the surface of the water. "Go in peace," she whispered. The bundle floated for a moment, then slowly drifted away, carried by the current, disappearing into the darkness. From behind her, she heard a sound, soft footsteps on wet earth. She turned. Damilola stood there, arms crossed, watching her. "You miss him," he said. She didn't lie. "Yes, but not the man he became, the boy he used to be." Damilola walked to her side and sat. "I hated him," he admitted. "I know. I still do. Sometimes. Then I think, maybe he was just lost. Maybe the city broke him before he even knew how to be whole." She nodded. "He died, saving us." They sat in silence again, this time listening to the rhythm of the river, the song of frogs in the distance, the breath of the night. Damilola reached for her hand again. "Come back to bed," he said softly. She leaned into him, rested her head on his shoulder. In a moment, back inside their home, the wind moved through the windows, not cold, not sharp, just passing through. The shadows no longer clung to the walls, the air no longer trembled with unspoken things. Weeks turned into months, The rains gave way to sun, and the fields bloomed. Damilola's harvest returned with abundance. Abeni opened a stall at the market again, her hands busy with fabric and dyes, her voice returning to laughter. People greeted them differently now, with respect, yes, but also with awe. It was said that they had faced a spirit and survived, that their love had become something sacred, tempered in fire and darkness. One day, Nana Ajua visited them. Her steps were slow, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She took tea in their courtyard and said nothing for a long time. Then, as she stood to leave, she looked directly at Abeni. "You carry him with you," she said. "That's good. The dead are not meant to be forgotten, but do not let him live in the space meant for your joy." Abeni bowed her head. "I understand." Nana Ajua smiled, then turned to Damilola. "And you, never let pride grow between you and truth. Spirits feed on silence more than they do blood." He nodded. "I'll remember." As the old woman left, Abeni and Damilola remained in the courtyard, sipping tea, watching their goats play at the edge of the compound. The world was still wounded, still imperfect, but they had reclaimed their place in it, and far beyond the forest, beneath the tree in the clearing where coffee had fallen, a single wildflower bloomed, white, silent, alive. The spirit was gone, but the memory would remain, etched in the earth, in the rain, in the silence between footsteps. A love misused, a soul redeemed, a lesson carved in fire. Sometimes love is not about holding on, it's about letting go, especially when what you thought was love becomes control, and what you wanted to save is destroyed by obsession. Coffee's story is a warning etched in silence and fire. When you try to force what isn't meant to be, you invite darkness into your own soul. But when love is true, it doesn't need to be summoned. It returns freely. What would you have done in Abeni's place? Was Coffee a victim of his own heart, or the architect of his own destruction? Tell us in the comments, is love ever worth the price of a soul? We're reading. And now, don't miss the next story already on your screen. Another tale is unfolding, and it just might leave you breathless.